I actually came to learn about these different compounds and how they were being used today through a friend of mine who's a former ranger who was dealing with a lot of his own issues with regard to traumatic brain injury, trauma, mental health, physical health, all these things. And he and I were really close, and he was telling me how he was planning on going to a retreat down to, I think for him, it was Costa Rica at the time through Heroic Hearts Project to do ayahuasca. And I was like, what? What? Like, what is that? And he was telling me about it, and I was super skeptical. I was like, this sounds like a bunch of snake oil and very weird, and I'm not sure I believe it. And so I was like, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. You have your experience while you're there doing your thing. I'm going to go research this. So I looked up the organization, and I also started to do some research, the medical, clinical, scientific research, not Wikipedia. And I dove into published articles that were actually fairly recent that were describing what it is, what ayahuasca is in particular, and highlighting some clinical studies that had been done in Brazil and some other areas. And I was like, whoa, why am I just now hearing about this, working in the space that I'm in, and with the neuroscience background that I have? Why am I just hearing about this? And why is it not mainstream, especially for these communities in need, like the veteran community, the first responder community, people with backgrounds of trauma? Why is this not mainstream?
You're listening to the Born Primitive Podcast.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Born Primitive Podcast. How we doing, Tony?
Doing good.
Get it in this morning?
Got it in.
Attaboy. I always see you there. I don't know why I asked that. It's more for the audience.
Yeah,
we're keeping you accountable. So hey, today, guys, we have a really unique guest. And this is a topic that's, quite different than what we're used to talking about, but there's been more and more literature on this and more, I would say, breakthroughs that we thought it was worth diving into. Kate is a friend of mine and, is a subject matter expert in this. So we're going to get a little into the psychedelics and, word of caution, obviously do your research and, if you feel like this is something for you, just do it smartly. But I think there's emerging kind of acceptance that there's a place for this in mental health. And Tony and Kate both have experienced that themselves. So without further ado, we have Dr. Kate Pate here. She is a Ph.D. neurophysiologist, coach, entrepreneur, researcher, and humanist. She advocates for functional and non-traditional approaches to healing. And her primary objective are to help people find the path to healing that works best for them. To change the narrative around how we discuss health in our communities, and ultimately to remove the stigma associated with diagnoses and asking for help. And a lot of this, as I think Kate would say, is rooted in kind of her own experiences and invisible injuries. And Kate has also served on multiple boards, working with numerous organizations, including the NFL, and is all over the podcast scene too, with kind of her knowledge base on this. So, without further ado, Kate, it's good to see you again, and welcome to the Born Primitive Podcast.
Thanks so much. I'm stoked to be here.
So I want to get right into it. We were talking about this, just a minute ago off air, but for me, former military guy, I'm hearing a lot about psychedelics, right? And you see it on Rogan. It's like becoming more mainstream, and maybe not mainstream is the right word yet, but it's getting more talked about. So for, a knuckle dragger like me that really doesn't know anything about it, and for some of the viewers who might have heard a lot about psychedelics, in this case, the lens I'm seeing it through is through the, from a lens of a former, military guy, but I know it's not just military people or first responders that can benefit from this. I mean, this is everyday kind of mental health stuff. So can you, for the viewers, break down some of the psychedelics that are out there, and maybe just if you could take a step back before that, is like how we evolved to where we are right now with this becoming a more, kind of tried thing, and kind of where you feel like we are in that progression of it becoming potentially mainstream. Maybe it will never become mainstream, but at least it feels like we're making progress. And I think I see it almost similar to like stem cell. It's like we have this like medical breakthrough happening, but for whatever reason, there's this like inertia that's like stopping it from just becoming the thing. Like, you got like orthopedic surgeons who can like literally inject you with a stem cell injection in your ACL and like repair it instead, like, they'd rather do like an ACL surgery. And it's like, wait a second, why are we not embracing these emerging technologies that clearly have some clout? So kind of a loaded question, but for someone who knows nothing about psychedelics as it pertains to kind of mental health, and just break it all down for us. And if you could potentially list out a few of the common ones, and where those might be applicable depending on someone's personal circumstance. I know that's a loaded question, but I know I think you got it.
Yeah, there's a lot there. This all goes back. I mean, some of these psychedelics that we're talking about, some of these compounds have been used in ceremonial settings within different indigenous populations for millennia. But some of the more recent discussions around psychedelics really started to kind of become more popularized, especially in Western cultures. Back in the 40s and 50s is kind of when it started. And that's when we started to see, LSD was synthesized, and we started to see other compounds become more mainstream, where Westerners were going down to like Mexico, for example, and partaking in psilocybin or magic mushroom ceremonies. And MDMA was another compound that was synthesized, and which is ecstasy, Molly. I'll talk about all these in just a second. But we started to see some momentum around psychedelics in the 40s and 50s, and researchers and clinicians started to get interested in these compounds for a number of reasons. Started with, hey, maybe we can mimic some different mental health conditions like schizophrenia, for example. Maybe we can mimic these with these compounds and then study them and understand them. And people started to see that actually some of these compounds had really intense therapeutic benefits. And they started testing them in different types of conditions like alcohol use disorder and other types of addictions, and started to see a lot of really incredible benefit to some of these compounds. And then kind of fast forward a little bit, and these became more popularized back in the 40s, 50s, and then the 60s, and we started to see some of these compounds get out of the laboratory environment and become more mainstream. And what happened back then was just sort of this, they got into the hands of everybody started doing it, and then of course that ended up leading to some really negative outcomes in certain circumstances, and then of course the war on drugs, which put a kibosh on everything. But when I started getting into psychedelic research through my work with the Heroic Hearts Project back in 2018, 2019 timeframe, my understanding, I didn't really understand it at all. Coming from a neurophysiologist perspective, I was a kid who grew up with the war on drugs, and drugs are bad and your brain is like a fried egg. This is sort of the narrative that I was fed and believed. And when I started looking into the research back to, really 50, 60, 70 years ago, I was shocked by how incredible some of these compounds seemed to perform for certain really dire conditions that really were untreated in the years since. And so I was shocked to know, wow, there was great benefit back then. It was shut down, and that was really to the detriment of humanity, I think. However, there are certain maybe safety measures that should be in place with some of these substances, and I don't necessarily think that putting restrictions in place or trying to safeguard that was a bad idea. I just think the war on drugs kind of maybe was a little bit too intense to shut down the research. But that said, there were still diehard researchers dedicated to these compounds and understanding them for the benefit of humanity, who quietly behind the scenes kept pushing and trying to make sure that the research didn't stop forever. One big organization and player in this space is called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. And their community of researchers and clinicians has really been a big part of getting these compounds out into the research community once again, and hopefully into the clinical space here very soon. So there were people who were continuing to push and try to do things, quote unquote, above board. So that way we could continue the research, but not end up in the same situation we saw back in the 60s and the early 70s, where things were shut down. So people who started the research up again in the 90s and then into the 2000s and, currently really have been working to make sure that the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed in clinical research. So that way everything is progressing in a positive way and it's not shut down again. So all of that said, where we are right now is some of these compounds, and I'll break them down in just a second. Some of these compounds are actually getting breakthrough designation by the FDA because of the body of clinical evidence from all of these diligent researchers for decades have been compiling. They're now the FDA is seeing the therapeutic benefit for things that really, conditions that really don't have good treatments. So for example, major depressive disorder, treatment-resistant depression, and even PTSD, the FDA has designated breakthrough therapy designation for these compounds. Now, that doesn't mean that the FDA is saying these are legal substances, you should be able to use them or prescribe them, but they're saying, hey, this is a fast track. We see the body of evidence for these things and their ability to treat these really difficult conditions. Let's fast track the regulatory process so that way we can get them out there into the hands of the end users and hopefully help people. So that's sort of a big overview of the history around this that's relevant to the discussion today. And then, the compounds are, there's a bunch of new ones kind of popping out on the market all the time because companies are trying to capitalize on this and sort of make a proprietary substance that they can make money off of. So, just for people out there who may not know anything about the field, you'll probably see lots of iterations of, like, for example, the active component in magic mushrooms is psilocybin. That's the hallucinogenic component. So a lot of times people will just say psilocybin when they mean magic mushrooms, right? Like the dried mushrooms that are ingested. But there's lots of variations of the psilocybin compound that different pharmaceutical companies are trying to, make and tweak a little bit. And so people may see some of those types of molecules being talked about in the news. They're not necessarily commercially available, but they, talked about in the news. So we have the classic tryptamine psychedelics are the ones that really look a lot like serotonin as a molecule. And so that would be, and they actually act on the serotonin system in the body and among other systems, but serotonin is one big system that they work on because they look like serotonin. So the molecule like psilocybin, for example, that, and it's broken down into, which is psilocin, the body sees that and it sort of mimics the shape of serotonin. And so these compounds can interact with the serotonin receptors in the body.
What is serotonin again?
So serotonin is a neurotransmitter in the body, and it densely, there's a lot of receptors throughout the body, in the heart, in the vasculature, like the blood vessels, in the brain, especially in neurons. And the most dense area is in the brain, in the neuronal, the cells of the brain, in those cell types. And so when you take a bunch of serotonin, for example, whether you're, like, just for hypothetical purposes, if you just were to get a bunch of serotonin in your body, it would float around throughout the body. And anywhere there's a serotonin receptor, it might interact with that receptor, which would cause the receptors are on the outside of the cell. And the receptor molecule interaction causes an internal cellular change that might lead to transcription of a gene, which could create a protein in that cell. So there's lots of different cascades, these intracellular cascades that can occur when these molecules are interacting with these different receptors in the body. And sometimes that can be a really good thing, depending on the cell type, the receptor, and sometimes that could be a really bad thing. So, just keep in mind when we talk about the interaction of these compounds in the body, it's really hard to study because, we're really, as researchers, we often isolate things to study it well, but the implications are far more reaching than just, I'm studying a single interaction with this molecule and this receptor in this one cell type. Obviously, I'm a whole human being and everything's interacting all at once. And so when we talk about the effects that these molecules, these psychedelics have, we're talking about a very small fraction of what we actually know. It's really difficult to know for sure with any certainty what it's doing everywhere in the body. And so I say that as a caveat, because I'm going to talk about some benefits that people have found through research, but it's not a complete picture. And that's not a bad thing. It just means there's more to the story that people should be aware of. So the serotonin-like compounds include psilocybin and psilocin. So that's the compound in magic mushrooms. And then DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. People may hear or be familiar with DMT. They may have heard it as 5-MeO-DMT, or that's a compound that is found in different toad populations. It's sort of a toxin that's produced that can be harnessed and smoked. And it can also be synthetically made. So these DMT-based molecules don't necessarily have to come from nature. They can be synthesized in a laboratory. So sometimes people will talk about laboratory-based DMT, or maybe it's DMT from a toad, the 5-MeO version, or DMT from plants. So there are actually a lot of plants that contain DMT. And no, you can't just eat them and get high. I know a lot of people are always curious about that. Unfortunately, that's not true. You can't do that. But and the reason for it is that we have these compounds in our gut that break down the DMT. So DMT is found in another tryptamine-based psychedelic called ayahuasca. And ayahuasca is a tea that's brewed from the ayahuasca vine and a plant that contains DMT. And the ayahuasca vine actually has a compound in it that stops that breakdown process in the gut. So that way the DMT that's ingested with the vine in that tea actually stays bioavailable, meaning that it doesn't get broken down and it does have a hallucinogenic action in the body. And so when people talk about ayahuasca, they're really talking about the DMT that's in that tea that's having that hallucinogenic effect. There's also LSD, which people are more familiar with. That's a synthesized compound. It's not an actually naturally occurring substance found in a plant, although it was originally synthesized from organic material, sort of trying to mimic what the different compounds were in this ergot fungus. And then MDMA is another one that is not naturally occurring, that's synthesized, but MDMA, also known as ecstasy, Molly, different street names. That's a slightly different compound. It's called a phenethylamine, for those who really want to know, but it has some serotonin-like properties, but it also has widespread actions elsewhere in the body, and dopamine and epinephrine, norepinephrine, different areas, different receptor types like that. And then one that's similar to MDMA in structure is mescaline, which is an active compound found in like the peyote cactus, for example, or the San Pedro is another similar compound. So all of these different substances are lumped together as psychedelics, and they have some similar actions. But again, kind of talking about the cell types and the receptors that they interact with, they're all slightly different structures. And so they do have slightly different, results in their interactions in the body. And we haven't really characterized all of those well at this point. That's probably going to take a really long time. But, people are doing a lot of clinical research on these compounds now, and we may not know what's happening at a molecular cellular level throughout the body, but we are able to start characterizing the actual subjective experiences that people are having, and the safety profile, which is extremely important because some of these are extremely safe compounds and there are others that come with a lot of risk. So, and we can talk about those differences, as we get into all of that. But I don't know if that's maybe a good place to stop and wait for you guys to ask for some more questions, because I could keep talking for hours and go in the wrong direction with this.
I think that was a perfect intro and very thorough.
I want to ask real quick though, who was the first guy or girl that was like, you know what, I'm gonna get this frog poison and just smoke it?
He's been around for thousands.
No,
of
I know,
years.
but like, who was the first one? Is like, I got an idea.
I know.
I'm gonna get some frog poison and throw it in. I don't know. I'm guessing back then, like some kind of pipe or something, and just smoke it and see what happens. Like,
well, I'm sure
that's freaking wild. You know,
I'm sure
what I mean?
we could have a whole hour podcast just talking about that question, because when I was in Peru, that's something I continued to ask about ayahuasca. Was like, how for thousands of years did you guys know to combine these two completely random plants? This has been in their tradition for thousands of years. combine them into a mix and then boil it for 12 hours in order to be able to then drink it. Like, and there, that's why I say, like, I won't derail us, because it's a fascinating conversation, especially amongst traditional tribes, is like, the plants told us. That's their answer, is like, and they have a relationship. And it's actually a question I had for you, doctor, is like, you approach this from kind of two complete different ends of the spectrum. And it's something I respect when I was doing some research on kind of where you're at within the field, is that you have a Ph.D. and I think it was breath-brain connection. You're a neurophysiologist, but then you're also willing to expose kind of yourself to these substances in a way that you have personal experience. So what factors, and I think you said it was in 2018 that you kind of, it sparked, or at least it became a part of your lexicon, that this is something that like had been researched, but had kind of been buried and now was resurfacing. So what were the first steps you took, having a more traditional kind of modern science background, when you started to hear more about this? Did you double down on kind of the science side of it, or did you start to expose yourself to the more traditional side of it, which has been around for thousands of years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually came to learn about these different compounds and how they were being used today through a friend of mine who's a former ranger, who was dealing with a lot of his own issues with regard to traumatic brain injury, trauma, mental health, physical health, all these things. And he and I were really close, and he was telling me how he was planning on going to a retreat down to, I think for him, it was Costa Rica at the time, through Heroic Hearts Project, to do ayahuasca. And I was like, what? What? Like, what is that? And he was telling me about it, and I was super skeptical. I was like, this sounds like a bunch of snake oil and very weird, and I'm not sure I believe it. And so I was like, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. You have your experience while you're there doing your thing. I'm going to go research this. So I looked up the organization, and I also started to do some research, the medical, clinical, scientific research, not Wikipedia. And I dove into published articles that were actually fairly recent, that were describing what it is, what ayahuasca is in particular, and highlighting some clinical studies that had been done in Brazil and some other areas. And I was like, whoa, there's rigorous science behind this, first of all. And second of all, the potential to really help people like my buddy and others. I was working in the SOF community at the time, and obviously had lots of friends who had been blown up and who were dealing with lots of other mental health and, physical health issues that were really challenging and to address through the traditional channels. In fact, a lot of them were getting worse on the treatment path that they were given through the traditional channels. So I was blown away, and I was like, man, this has great potential. Let me go read about these other compounds, because again, my, DARE, keep kids off drugs, brain started to turn and reflect on, well, these things were supposed to be bad. How are they helping people? So that then led me down this other research path into these other, like psilocybin and LSD. And there was not only the historical literature that I found, but then the more recent research and clinical studies. And I was just like, whoa, why am I just now hearing about this, working in the space that I'm in, and with the neuroscience background that I have? Why am I just hearing about this? And why is it not mainstream, especially for these communities in need, like the veteran community, the first responder community, people with backgrounds of trauma? Why is this not mainstream? And so I started to reach out to different people to see what others knew. And then I connected with Heroic Hearts Project and Jesse, the founder. And of course, my buddy got back from his retreat, and he was like a totally different person after that. So then I was a believer from the sense of seeing the actual change in this person that I knew pretty well. And that was surprising to me as well. And so when I reached out to Jesse, I was like, hey, I don't know what I can offer you, but I am here to help. This sounds incredible. I'd love to learn more. And I became their director of research. He basically was like, this is great. We're a new organization. We'd love to have you join our team and help us with some research. And so I was like, yes, that sounds great. I would love to do that. So I joined Heroic Hearts Project in 2018, late 2018, early 2019 as the director of research. And we started to do some research on ayahuasca in veterans, looking at changes in the gut microbiome, looking at long-term changes in symptoms and personality and different things like that, that were, some of that's been published, but the gut microbiome stuff we're still finalizing, which hopefully that paper will come out this year. But through that process, Jesse was like, well, do you want to go on a retreat so you can see what it's like and experience it yourself, but also witness what it's like for other people? And I was like, I mean, I'm a little nervous, but sure. Yeah, like, why not? If I am advocating for something, I should know what it's like. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm saying everybody needs to go do everything under the sun in order to be able to speak about it and help people. But for me, I didn't even have any close experience with psychedelics that I could even draw upon at that point. So for me, it just seemed like something that would be worthwhile. And to be fair, I was dealing with, I'm human too, and I've had my own traumas, and I actually was really struggling at the time with my own internal shit. I mean, honestly, like I had a lot of stuff going on. I learned at a very young age to cope in very unhealthy ways with the challenges of life and with trauma. And so I ended up developing a lot of addictive issues over the years that included everything from alcohol and pills and various types of eating disorders that were really harmful. And nobody ever really knew because one, of course, there's shame there. So I never really talked about it. But outwardly, I was successful and nobody knew any different. Nobody knew otherwise. And so I was like, well, if I can hide this from everybody and prevent the shame that would be associated with actually talking about it, then that'll make me feel better. And then also maybe it's not that bad. Maybe I can keep lying to myself and say that I don't really have a problem if, like, outwardly I still seem to be performing, right, athletically and academically and all of these things. And so for me, it was kind of a time in my life where I was really getting honest with myself about my own path of self-destruction and recognizing, wow, all these other things that I've tried to heal myself with over the years, meditation retreats, for example, yoga training, and all of, therapy, all these different things, they helped, but they never really fixed the core problem for me. And I was curious about the potential, after everything I had read, about these substances to potentially help somebody like me too. I mean, I didn't have combat trauma. I didn't have the same childhood that a lot of these other people had growing up. I had my own types of adversity, but nothing like some of my friends were dealing with. And, I was like, well, if there's hope for me, then maybe there's hope for everybody, because, it's not just the combat veteran that can benefit from this type of approach. So I went down there both from a curiosity standpoint, the academic side, and then very deeply personal side of things too, hoping for my own healing. And really had no expectations going in, but was not, there's no way you can prepare for something like that until you actually do it, in the sense of, you don't know what it's going to be like. It's unlike anything else that you've ever experienced. And so, I just went for it. And it was really, really challenging in a lot of ways, especially because I wasn't used to experiences like that, of being sort of not out of control, but yeah, I mean, you kind of have to surrender and let go of the control of what's happening physically to your body, but also to your mind. And you can bring curiosity to it, and you can sort of direct your experience a little bit, but you're really, there's a lot of letting go that has to happen. And that was new for me. And a lot of the experiences, each night in this particular case, like Heroic Hearts Project, the way that they do these retreats, often, regardless of where you go, whether we were in Peru for this, but Mexico, Costa Rica, wherever, there's like a period of, say, 5, 6, 7 days, and you have multiple ayahuasca ceremonies throughout that week. We did 4, and that entails, nighttime ceremonies. They can last 4 to 6 hours, where you're having this really intense experience, and it's waves. You feel like you're coming out of it, and then you go back in, and you feel like you're coming out of it, and you go back in, and sometimes it's extremely challenging. Sometimes it's scary, difficult. Sometimes it's beautiful, the most loving, incredible happy experience you've ever felt. I mean, there's the range of highs and lows that you go through in these types of experiences is incredible. And that happens every time. Every night is very different. You never get the same experience twice. So what happened last night may have nothing to do with what's going to happen this night. And that's something else for people to know, is that when people share their experiences, that's helpful to kind of understand maybe the range of what people go through, but by no means is that sort of a roadmap for what your experience might be like. So just know that as people are explaining this to you, if you're curious around this, that your experience is going to be totally unique. But I had a lot of things happen for me that week that were really powerful, that allowed me to see myself and my life in totally new ways that were extremely helpful, extremely cathartic. That people often talk about the powerful perspective shift that happens. And, the cliche is that it's like 20 years of therapy in one night. And I kind of hate that, but I get why people say it, because it's for those of us, like I grew up in a very, with a very rigid mindset about emotions and experience, and, not really in touch with a lot of emotion. So for those of us in that arena who are maybe cut off from a lot of the really intense emotions and have avoided feeling them, sometimes in therapy, when your therapist or whoever you're working with who's trying to get you to access stuff, you might be super willing to actually do the work in that moment. But because of all your years of conditioning and patterning, it actually might be really hard for you to access some of that, even though you're willing, because it just is so foreign, and your body and nervous system is not used to going there. Whereas when you do something like this, it often breaks down these walls that are barriers to accessing some of this really deep, rich stuff. And sometimes it's forced upon you for better or worse. But for me, that was really helpful, because I got to feel things and access things that like I normally couldn't, and honestly didn't even know it was there. So that was powerful for me. But some of the guys, so I was with a group of, it was mostly SOF veterans, but Heroic Hearts Project service, like they help all veterans, period. You don't have to be a SOF, community member for that. So we had a couple of guys who were not SOF, but it was a small group, and everybody came with different baggage, with different stuff, different intentions. And everybody got something incredibly profound out of that week. And there were multiple people there who were on the verge of suicide prior. And it was really, they were having a really horrible time, and they were not okay, and they didn't know what else to do. They had tried a lot of other things and were really skeptical of the pill route. Maybe they had been down that already, and it scared them with how much worse they got, or maybe they were just reluctant to try it to begin with, but they had tried lots of other things. And whether it was severe depression or suicidality or real physical ailments, all of these guys came out of that with profound, good, beneficial changes. And to see everybody's face, pictures of us when we first arrived, to the joy and the relief and the just peace that you saw in people by the end of that week. It was, I mean, if a picture, say a picture says 1,000 words, I mean, it really, those pictures alone were really powerful to witness. So that was my experience. And I've had multiple experiences with ayahuasca and psilocybin and others over the years that, for various reasons, drew me back to the medicine and learned different things at different times to help with different intentions. But that was my first journey with all of this. That was, it was really powerful. So, and Heroic Hearts Project is still doing all of that work today.
Well, yeah, thanks for sharing your kind of first experience. And did that create any conflicting, like with your background being so heavy in like traditional modern science? It sounds like you'd already been involved in yoga and breath work, so that probably was at least like a bit of a segue into this world. But did you find then any conflicting feelings about the subjective experience you just had while down on the retreat, and then maybe the typical way you would think through it as like that had been done before regarding psychedelics, kind of, as you said earlier, trying to reduce it down to like, what is the mechanism here? Whereas I think you would agree with this, is that experience, there is a physiological effect, but then there's a psychological and a spiritual effect that you can't even put into words. For us to sit here and try to unpack what that feels like when you have those breakthrough moments would do it no justice. So did you feel kind of a conflicting pull of the two different worlds now that you had been exposed to that one and then your traditional kind of science background?
I wouldn't say that they were conflicting. I think for me, it was actually like, I've always been able to walk on either side of the line. And maybe that's why I wouldn't say like I'm a bad scientist, but like I was really bad at focusing on one thing and becoming like the world's leading expert in this one thing, because I love the science and understanding things in the material created world as best we can through the scientific method. But I also really appreciate and love the immaterial and the spiritual side. And I, just because we can't measure it with the scientific method doesn't necessarily mean that it's not equally important or it's not real. And so I'm able to hold maybe both of those kind of perspectives in mind at once. So for me, I didn't feel a conflict. I actually felt really excited to be able to go look into the literature, or perhaps do my own research, like through Heroic Hearts Project, to maybe find some ways scientifically to explain or point at what I was actually experiencing. I found that to be kind of a fun journey for me personally. But to your point, there are people who are staunchly in one camp, and they only want to see it from one side. And I don't think that's helpful. I think that we need to synthesize all perspectives around this. So I guess, yeah, from my perspective, there was no internal conflict there. I was really curious, though, to learn more. I wanted to know more than what we know. I mean, again, research takes a long time to develop, and these fields they're not new, but there's so much to explore that it's going to be a really long time until we actually can say definitively what's really happening, and with all these different compounds and in different people, right? Like, we're all different humans. And so it's going to take some time to figure all of that out. But I am excited to see a lot of people researching these compounds in therapeutic settings and outside of that. One thing that to kind of get back at one of the things you mentioned, I agree with you that there are absolutely physiological changes that are going on that can be really beneficial health-wise. They can also be beneficial mental health-wise, be due to indirect paths like inflammation, for example, controlling inflammation. They can impact mental health through that. But there is that subjective psychological experience too that also is profound. And say you could get rid of the physiological effects and only have the psychological effects, that might actually lead to physiological changes over time because of a perspective shift that leads to better mental health and alleviation of symptoms that ultimately improves somebody's physiology, right? We know how stress impacts the body. And so if you can flip your perspective to maybe not be one of high anxiety or stress or maybe being prone to depression, if you can kind of get out of that through some psychological changes, then physiology may follow suit. Because as we know, mental, physical, spiritual health are all tightly intertwined. And so as you improve one, the others kind of get dragged along in a positive direction too. But one thing that is interesting is DARPA is actually funding, and others have done this too, but DARPA, which to me is really interesting that they're funding this, tens of millions of dollars into psychedelic research to see if we can harness the physiological changes of the compounds for health without actually causing the psychological, subjective, hallucinogenic experience. And I get why they're doing it. And I think it's an interesting scientific question, but I also see it as maybe a sort of missing the point, and that the psychological subjective experience is a big part of the change. And I think that's maybe not always necessary, but is really important for certain types of things. And so I just think it's funny. It's like, hey, these compounds really help a lot of people with, addressing all these different issues. Let's try to take the subjective experience out and just focus on the physiological. But I
think something you said there I think is so powerful, is that the subtle stories you tell yourself, the ability to go in there and kind of examine those. And sometimes you even said it earlier, sometimes by force. Like, I think once you get more experience with the different plants and the different medicines, you can, and you said this earlier as well, you can start to lead the ceremony a little, or not lead it, but at least have an intention and kind of stick with it and examine something through and through. But then there are other times you're forced to look at things, and these could be things from your childhood. They could be things that happen when you're a teenager, that the ability for those to the substance to catalyze you being able to go in there and reanalyze a situation and then come out with a fresh story is something, unless you've been in that space, it's just words. But once you experience that, it's revelational in the sense that, like, how can this thing, like, you almost, and that's part of like kind of drumming up some subconscious things, is like, I didn't even know that was in there. Then I just spent 5 hours examining something that I realized had a huge effect on the way I talked to myself or the stories I was telling myself. So yeah, to remove kind of the subjective experience, I think you're losing some of the magic. But I do understand as well, like there are the more kind of just pure physiological effects that you can obtain through that. So yeah, very, very interesting. And have you, in your experience, because you now, as you said, have gone through several ayahuasca ceremonies as well as psilocybin, what are the differences in those? Because those two are the ones being talked about, I think, a lot at least in the military communities here that we're around, is kind of psilocybin, magic mushrooms, and then ayahuasca. So on a personal level, what have you found the difference between those kind of two different types of ceremonies to be?
That's a good question. I might want to, I can tell you my subjective experience, but I could also kind of talk about how these different compounds are being used, because I think that might also be helpful to the community if people are like, well, I'm really dealing, I'm battling with this, and maybe there's like one psychedelic that's better than another for that. So I would say for me, ayahuasca was something that, so for example, I mentioned what that entails, right? That week journey somewhere, probably not here in the States, although I've done it in the States and under the church, religious exemption. It's still a gray area for legality issues though. So if anyone is really worried about legal issues, go where it's legal, right? So we didn't talk about the legal stuff yet, but you can go to countries where ayahuasca and psychedelics are legal, and it's all above board, so you don't have to worry about any ramifications with that. But I would say for ayahuasca, because I've traveled places and it's typically a longer, like week type ceremony, there's very strict dietary requirements as a part of it. So for me, ayahuasca is a much bigger commitment, and mentally the preparation that goes into it and the intention setting and all of that was very significant, as opposed to psilocybin, which I've also done in ceremonial type settings. But that was, for me, you can do it in a retreat setting like that, where you're gone for a week, you have multiple ceremonies one per evening, multiple evenings during that week. But it's also easier to do psilocybin in, like, for example, like a weekend, right? Like you have one evening of a really deep dive ceremony, and then the next day to kind of integrate, and you don't necessarily have as many dietary and behavioral requirements, because the safety profile of psilocybin is a lot safer than something like ayahuasca. And so for me, ayahuasca always felt like a much bigger commitment. And I always got, people always say, do the work, the air quotes, the work or whatever. And ultimately what they mean is don't just go do drugs, right? Like, and expect to be different. You have to put in a lot of effort for preparation and integration afterwards for, but basically that means, how am I going to incorporate these perspective shifts, this information into my life to lead to lasting change? Because if you don't do that, you're going to be the same person, just with a really cool peak experience to talk about, and nothing will change. So for me, ayahuasca always felt like a bigger commitment. There was more to prepare for, more to integrate, but the medicine itself always felt more intense as well for me. And that's just my own experience. With psilocybin, I would say for me, it was always, could be very intense and an emotional roller coaster. as far as like sadness and joy and all of the things that I felt, but it ultimately felt a lot more loving and a lot less hard. Ayahuasca felt really hard almost every single time, but in a good way. You know, it was always good feelings afterwards, and great change that came with that. So those were my experiences with the two. But I would say that for those maybe questioning what they're used for, one of the things I'll say is, at least with regard to how they're being studied clinically. So I think the first legal psychedelic we're going to have will be MDMA, and it'll actually probably be this year. The FDA is currently reviewing a application for an investigational new drug treatment for MDMA as MDMA assisted psychotherapy for the specific treatment of PTSD. And I think that'll be approved this year. So with that, then the MDMA could be available clinically. So your clinician could prescribe it, and it would be given in a therapeutic setting, with the therapy or psychotherapy being the main treatment. But MDMA is sort of the assist in that process to help people access the emotional stuff that they may not necessarily be able to access. So that's probably going to happen this year. So MDMA is heavily being researched and used clinically for PTSD, along with psychotherapy. So for people out there dealing with PTSD, we have never seen anything else even come close to accomplishing what MDMA assisted psychotherapy can do for that. So that's something to keep in mind with MDMA. And then with regard to psilocybin, so the FDA has designated breakthrough therapy for psilocybin for both treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder. Again, you know, people have been using SSRIs and antidepressants for decades, and so few people respond well. And those who respond well often become treatment resistant over time. So we have not had any kind of therapeutic really even come close to touching this problem either. And psilocybin is light years ahead of what these other, you know, traditional antidepressants have been as far as outcomes, positive outcomes. And so I think psilocybin will be next. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, there's going to be a lot of different proprietary psilocybin compounds out there, and everybody's going to want to have their pill prescribed, and it's going to be the pharma, you know, market all over again. But it will be through, you know, these different really beneficial compounds this time, which is great. Probably through all of this, they're going to have to reschedule these substances and decriminalize, and then potentially even legalize some of them. So people might be able to just across the board grow their own and take their own, and, you know, that remains to be seen. But so that's psilocybin. And then psilocybin has also been greatly, I guess, used with great benefit for alcohol use disorder and other substance use disorders and smoking cessation. So for addiction type disorders, psilocybin therapy, psilocybin assisted therapy has been really powerful for helping bring about positive change in these different communities. And again, with addiction, as we know, it's through the roof in certain ways, and we really need to figure out solutions here. Another one that's really important for addiction, especially opioid addiction, is ibogaine. And we didn't necessarily get into that too much, but ibogaine is the compound found in iboga, which is an African shrub. And that's being used actually to a great deal in the SOF community. There's an organization called, it's like Heroic Hearts Project, but it's sort of SOF specific, but Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions. Amber and Marcus are great humans. They're doing great work with that organization. And they leave the option of what psychedelic or what type of healing modality to do up to the individual. But a lot of individuals from the community, a lot of them come from the SEAL community. I'm sure you guys are aware, probably have lots of friends work with them over the years, but a lot choose ibogaine for their treatment. And part of that is, you know, some of them may be dealing with addiction type issues, and ibogaine can be very powerful for that, especially for opioid addiction, but also the implications it seems to have for healing brain injury. Or maybe we don't, again, I can't say that it heals brains following brain injury, but it seems to improve the symptoms that people experience after chronic TBI. That it seems that ibogaine addresses a lot of those types of things. And so that's being explored as well. And anyone who has a history of brain injury, ibogaine in theory could be, you know, something to explore. It does come with medical risks, so it's not necessarily the same safety profile like something like psilocybin. You need a medical staff available to manage the individuals taking it. But when done safely, and sometimes with magnesium, because part of the issue is cardiac arrhythmias, but if you take it with magnesium, you know, there's potential benefits to that, and prevention measures against the cardiac issues. But that's being explored as well. So ibogaine is another one that's really powerful. And then LSD is another really powerful one that's being explored for a number of different treatment options as well. People also microdose that. We didn't really talk about microdosing yet, but that's one of the ones that people will try to microdose sometimes, LSD. And again, similar kind of safety profile to like probably psilocybin. So those are some of the options for different people out there who are curious around this. And then we didn't talk about ketamine, but ketamine also, that's legal. It's, you know, used currently. It's a dissociative anesthetic. It's not a psychedelic, but people sometimes lump it in with these different compounds just because it does create some hallucinogenic like experiences in individuals. They're more dissociative, but people do kind of say that sometimes that can happen. It feels more like a psychedelic to them, but that is also being used for a number of different treatments currently, being explored for depression, suicidality, PTSD. So again, you know, it's worth looking into all these things. Just keep in mind that there's always bad actors in this space, and regardless of what space it is. And it's really important, especially when we're talking about these kinds of experiences, that you do it with people you trust and vetted organizations, vetted practitioners and facilitators. It's really important. So I guess maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, something I'd love you to go a little deeper on, and you just mentioned it, is the integration side of things, because I know you and I could sit here and tell subjective stories about our experience and how insanely beneficial it is, but there is a lot of work on the back end that is as important, if not more important, than the actual experience itself. Because you are, and I think you would agree, doctors, that like in that ceremony, you can, not always, but you're opening Pandora's box a little bit. And when you do that, you're going to have thoughts, feelings, emotions come out of yourself that you may not have even known were in there. And on the back end, if you think you can just go back to your old habits and your old ways of living, there's going to be a resistance there, and can actually create, and this is my experience of seeing some people go through this, a friction that was actually worse than prior to, because like I said, you've kind of cracked open the box and now everything's coming out of it. So there, it's the importance. And I think we actually talked about it with Bedros on his podcast of, you need to have a strong support system, and you have to have a plan, and you have to listen. And when I say that, is like a lot of times, and I'll interject my subjective experience over the last 10 years, is insights will come through, and like it's on you then to actually integrate that insight. And it could be as simple as the way you're eating, the way you're moving, things like that. It is, I always say, like, those plants are a catalyst for the divine to come through, but you need to listen to whatever comes through. And like there, and it doesn't need to be externalized either. I kind of hold true to myself, or at least in my own kind of thoughts around this, that like you should feel empowered leaving this, that you have the power to make changes. But I do see a lot of people that try to hop right back into their normal lives, and that could be a toxic relationship, a toxic work environment, and it kind of is destabilizing for a certain period until they're willing to kind of take a look and say, oh my gosh, I'm still involved in the exact things I was trying to solve. So can you unpack that a little bit, and just kind of your way to approach that? Because I know the integration side is so important.
Yeah, I mean, that's everything. And I'm glad you brought it up, because a lot of people don't maybe invest in it enough. They feel so good sometimes coming out of these experiences that it's like, oh, everything's going to be fine now. I'm just going to go back to my life, but I'm like me 2.0 and it's going to be great, you know? And I know it feels like that. And I've done this. So I'm also an example of like what not to do. So I've done this and learned the hard way. But I've also seen it. I'm a coach, and I've been an integration coach for a lot of people over the years, and I've seen it as well. And it's painful to watch because you know what's coming, but sometimes you gotta let people, figure it out on their own, and then come out of it and learn something from that. But to your point, you do feel good sometimes afterwards, and you're like, oh, it's going to be so easy for me to just be a different person in the world now. And there is a very critical window following these experiences that it creates a sort of a, we think neuroplasticity is at play here with regard to being able to like create new neural pathways, for example, in the aftermath of an experience like this. There's a therapeutic window that's open in proportion to the duration of how long the drugs act. So, for example, psilocybin 4 to 6 hours versus ibogaine, which is like, it could be 36 hours that this thing is having an action on your body. The window for ibogaine following treatment is open way longer than it is for psilocybin. Psilocybin might be, 2 weeks. Ibogaine could be maybe 4 to 6 weeks. And this critical period essentially is an opportunity for an individual to make changes that essentially get reinforced and stick in a really helpful way that may have been really hard to do prior to going on this journey and taking these substances. Like, for example, people have talked about it as like ruts, right? Like if you ride your bike in mud, you create a little rut. And if you keep going in that same path over and over and over again, that rut gets deeper. And one day you decide you want to go off into this field, way out to the right. And you try to steer your bike over there, but your rut is so deep that you see where you want to go, but you can't physically make it happen. So what some of these compounds seem to do is smooth out these ruts. Oh, hey, smooth out these ruts over time. That now, you see you want to go into a new direction, and you can actually go there much easier now. So they create this window of opportunity for you to make good changes or bad. So again, neuroplasticity it's non-judgmental. It doesn't care which way you go. It's just providing an opportunity. So to what you're describing, when you get out of an experience like this, it's really important that you put positive practices and changes into place to develop good habits, because one, it's going to be easier for you to start, but two, it's going to get reinforced and hopefully continue over time. Whereas if you come out of this experience and you're on cloud nine, you feel great, and you go right back to your same life, living the same thing, doing the same thing, thinking the same ways, treating your body the same diet, same, toxic people, all of this, you're just going to end up back where you were to begin with. And it's potentially going to be more reinforced now, or it's going to feel worse because you might know how good it could be. And now you're back to where you were before. Whereas at the beginning, you kind of like ignorance is bliss. You didn't know how good it could feel yet. And then now you're like, oh no, I really felt great and I'm feeling awful again. So that critical window is super important for making good habits stick over time. And I think that a lot of people don't take advantage of that. But I think that the integration period also is really critical for people to be very reflective. You're going to come out, and like for me, for example, it was like, I got out of an experience once and it was like, well, I need to break up with my boyfriend. I need to quit my job. I need to move to this place. I need to, all of these different things that happened to me afterwards that were maybe born from these intense experiences and feelings, and seeing how, I wasn't living the life that I really wanted to live. That did not necessarily mean I needed to do any of those things. In fact, it was more of an internal shift I was dealing with that didn't have to do with some of these external changes that I thought I needed to make. So I always tell people when they come out of it too, to really take inventory of what they're feeling and where it's coming from, and just sit with it. Because a lot of times in that aftermath, you have these profound insights, but they haven't settled yet. You haven't turned it into wisdom. You haven't owned it yet. It hasn't played out in a way that makes sense to you yet. So it's really important to just sit with this stuff sometimes and make sure that you are reflecting in a helpful, appropriate way. And it's not an emotional response to what you just went through. But to that point, I would say it's really helpful to do a lot of work first. So that way you're setting yourself up for coming back and having a successful transition and integration, because if you know that you have toxic relationships in your life, or you know you're going to come home to an environment where maybe you don't want to drink and everybody you live with is, drinks excessively, or your job is toxic and legitimately toxic and it's not helpful and you don't want to be there, you might need to make some changes to set yourself up for success on the front end. So that way, when you come back, you're not jumping into an environment that's really unhelpful. And the last part of all of this that's really critical for people to know is that for those of us who grew up really out of touch with emotions and kind of the, let's like shove all of it down, I don't want to feel any of this stuff. Well, this opens up, like you mentioned, Pandora's box. It can kind of break you open, emotionally speaking, where instead of having this like 6-foot thick wall of armor around yourself where nothing can touch you, nothing affects you in the world, now afterwards it can feel like a raw nerve ending where you're so sensitive and you're so reactive to the good and the bad. I mean, every time I do this stuff and I come out of it, I'm very emotionally sensitive, and that can be a good thing, but it can also, you can feel really raw and fragile, and you don't want to jump into a really unhealthy environment when you're in that state, because it can actually work against you and be really unhelpful for your transition and your integration. So you want to set yourself up for success. Sometimes people take time off afterwards and they go travel for a week, or they come back and their partners are understanding and able to help them through it, and it's a healthy environment. And you just want to set yourself up for success there, because that's jarring sometimes to re-enter the world after such a profound experience and feel sort of like you don't really fit in, and you don't want to put yourself in that kind of a situation where integration becomes difficult.
Well, and what you said is so important too, is on the front end of this, so that the integration is obviously on the back end once you've had the experience, but on the front end, I recommend, and anyone that comes to talk to me about it, and I'm sure you get even exponentially more, is like, make sure before you then first off, never make an impulsive decision to go do a ceremony. Now, of course, it can move quick, and if you get the feeling that you should participate, that can move quick, but never do it out of impulse, and always talk to individuals that have been doing it for years. And I say that because, like, even myself, I'm still integrating things that happened 8 years ago in a 5-gram psilocybin ceremony, meaning like things come up that they take so much time to work out. And an individual, and especially if they're a friend, if somebody comes to me, it's like, hey, let's do a life check. How are your thoughts right now? How are your relationships? How are you eating? How are you moving? Like, do that with somebody first, because I think somebody that is in the space for the right reasons will tell you straight up. And it's never out of like a malicious intent of like, hey man, I would address these things, get these things at least in decent order. They don't need to be perfect, but let's at least take a look at these things together, try to get these in an okay spot, then maybe have a ceremony like that. Because if not, and once again, I've done this myself and I've seen a lot of people do it, is like, if you don't take care of those things, you can still have a magical transformative experience, but then the work on the back end gets harder and harder. And some of those big decisions, it could be a relationship that you realize you have to leave. It's like, hey, catch that on the front end. If you've been feeling that for years on years, and you just know you guys don't have, like, there's no optimism as far as the future of you and them, like, don't go do a ceremony to figure that out. Like, try to have those discussions on the front end, because you're just adding another variable that further complicates that. So really appreciate you saying that, because I think it's so important. Like, put a focus on the integration, but then also put a very like focused effort on the front end, because that's just as powerful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the intention is really critical. I mean, I know people who sort of chase the experience. You see it all the time. I see it in the veteran community, but I see it outside of that too, of people who they don't really fully integrate. Like, you could be a one and done person. You could do one experience with like ayahuasca, for example, and never feel like you need it again. And that would be incredible, right? Like, that's the goal. that'd be wonderful, but some people, for curiosity reasons or for other types of healing that they want to address, or there's various reasons why people would go back to the medicine. But sometimes, people can fall into this trap of doing it, what I would say, too much. And again, I don't know what it's like to be anybody other than me. So I don't want to necessarily, judge harshly anyone else, and their choices. But I would say that I have seen people kind of chasing the high and chasing the experience that they feel after a ceremony, and they go and do it time and time and time again, but they're actually not changing. And it's because they're not putting anything into place that is helpful. They're just trying to feel good all the time. And that's unrealistic. I mean, as a human being, it's never going to happen. And it sets them up for a lot of issues, a lot of problems. There's so many reasons why that's unhelpful, but it's something else to keep in mind. I think if you to your point about setting yourself up for success ahead of the time, check in with yourself about why you're doing it again, or maybe the first time you have these very clear intentions, but if you want to go back to the medicine, just checking in with yourself about what is it that I'm trying to actually get out of it this time. And, these are, again, we're talking about therapeutic types of experiences for people who are the recreational users who literally just like to have fun, and get high and do their thing. That's totally different, right? Like you guys are doing your thing in a very different kind of setting, but for therapeutic reasons, you find yourself going back to the medicine, really getting clear on your intention and being honest with yourself about that, I think is really helpful too.
Well, and there too is the importance of choosing a facilitator, a shaman, or even somebody a coach you're taking advice from, is look at their life, look in their eyes. First off, I always say, look in their eyes and you can feel is this somebody who's grounded within the space? Because you will, as you said earlier, there are a lot of bad actors here. So if you're looking for somebody to facilitate, or looking at a shaman, or even just yourself, if you're if you're progressing in a way that you should be doing it again, is your life getting better? And I don't mean that from a monetary standpoint. That of course could be a factor of it, but sure, spend some time around that person in their relationships. If they would happen to have a partner or even kids, what does that dynamic look like? Because the goal should be, and this is my subjective interjection, but you should be seeing those things better over time, because that's the magic of these substances, is that they allow you to build stronger relationships, bring forth your dream into your reality in a way that isn't woo-woo, that what do you want to do with your life? You can do that. Let's set up a system to do that. And I just find a lot of people who, and usually I'll just call it out, can go way too far on the hipster end, where they're now a self-proclaimed shaman. They'll facilitate for people, and it's wait a second, dude, you are having trouble paying your rent, your relationships are shitty, yet you're a shaman facilitating for people. And and I have seen it even within the special forces community, where extremely competent individuals in their career as let's call it a SEAL, because that's the community we're around most, will then get out and say they'll have one big experience, and all of a sudden they're facilitating for people. And it's whoa, I know you were extremely competent in your military field, but that does not just translate over to you now facilitating for other individuals because you had one experience. So I'm kind of in my soapbox, but I just think it's important because I have friends who have went to places and had a miserable experience. And then when they tell me how it was facilitated, what the setup was, I'm what the music, I'm oh my God, you should have never even sat for them. So just a word of caution, because I've seen that play out a lot as well.
And that was going to be my question, Doc, for the average viewer. Where I mean, there's so much information now. I mean, you listed 8 or 9 of these options. Where does the normal Joe Schmo go to research this and find reputable providers, and also then get the proper coaching on which one is best for them, if any of these are good for them? Because I think there's, I'm as capitalist as they come, right? I will always support capitalism, right? But with something like this, especially emerging things where there's a huge opportunity to make billions of dollars if you're the first mover to really corner the space, there's a little risk there. And we kind of saw this a little bit with testosterone clinics, right? Testosterone became this new thing where everyone's getting prescribed, and now you got a men's clinic on every block, and any guy can go in there and get testosterone. They're not going to tell literally anyone no, most likely. And it's a guy who's probably not that qualified, but he has the right acronym after his name, and here's your script, on your way, next guy. And it's a 15-minute consult, and you already have testosterone of 800. So this is a little different, but it's the same thing. while I want this to become, kind of capitalized and integrated into society as normal people, we got to be a little bit careful, because to your point, you can roll into some clinic that, it looks nice, it's got a nice, vibe and, the credentials, but it's a cookie cutter, kind of expansion on someone that's just trying to make a bunch of money. So I think, for Doc, where can the normal person navigate this to get educated and potentially find treatment providers in other countries, and then, kind of navigate it the right way, and, hopefully get to, that end state we're all trying to get to?
That is $1 million question, because unfortunately there is not one place to go for that kind of thing right now. But I would say, so because this is becoming more publicized, it's not mainstream yet, but it's getting there. There are, like I said, bad actors, charlatans out there, people just trying to make money and actually doing a lot of harm in the process. And I caution people to be very careful when they're doing research around centers, especially, or facilitators, shamans, practitioners, whatever you want to call them, because there is no credentialing around this either. There's no, anyone can call themselves a facilitator or a shaman. And, it's a very strange space. So I would say, if you're just trying to find information about psychedelics and what do they do and what are they, all of that, I would say that maps.org is a good place to go to start to see some information around, they have their clinical trials. They're working on specific psychedelics, but they do have a lot of information and a bunch of resources listed on their website. So if you're trying to find legit information about just the substances and what they do and how they're being used, all that, maps.org is great for that. I'm on the Psychedelic Medicine Association board, and that's an organization that exists to try to bridge the gap between the patient and the clinician, because a lot of clinicians are getting asked about these things and they don't know how to advise their patients. In fact, they gave a presentation to the NFL clinicians not that long ago for the exact same reason. The players are asking about psychedelics and the clinicians don't really have an answer for them, but they want, clinicians across the board, whether it's professional athletes or the average human, they're getting asked these questions and they don't know how best to advise, and they know that their patients are doing them anyway. And so they want to provide more information. So if you're a clinician, but also if you're a patient, you could benefit from this too. The Psychedelic Medicine Association also on their website has a lot of resources. I think some of their resources may be member only. And so you may have to become a member to access some of that, which I think it's $100 a year or something like that. But that's another area to explore as far as, website-based research goes. And then for the veterans out there, I would say to look up heroicheartsproject.org and Vet Solutions. They have great resources on their websites, and they're the ones who work with the veteran community. Again, Heroic Hearts Project is all veterans, and Vets is SOF focused, but they have vetted the center. So when you're talking about where do I go to do a retreat, that is also a very gray area. Talk to those organizations. And if you're not a veteran, but you're curious around where to go to do these things safely, I would still encourage you to contact them, because they're wonderful people. They will probably help you out. In fact, they probably have a bunch of resources listed, maybe not all their centers, but could probably provide that to you if you were curious and just wanted to go somewhere safe, because they have worked with, they put themselves through these experiences and go on these retreats before they ever send any of their grant recipients to them. And so they make sure that it is going to be safe and that it is a vetted center. So they have a list of people that they work with, of organizations that they work with. That's a place that I would highly recommend, both of those two organizations. Outside of that, you can certainly do your own research and find centers that offer ayahuasca ceremonies, for example, in Costa Rica, or, but a lot of them, I will say, are what we, often call in the space like ayahuasca tourism or, psychedelic tourism, where they're going to take a shit ton of your money. And it might be a really nice resort or maybe not, but the whole goal isn't really to help you heal. It's really about taking your money, giving you a nice week vacation, and sending you on your way. So keep that in mind. A lot of the centers that pop up that are like super popular, you might have a great experience there, but it's not necessarily set up for like deep dives of real healing work. Some of these places, especially if you see, like as an example, some of them will have like 2 shamans in a giant maloka full of maybe like 30 or 40 people in one facility. And to me, after doing this with like 8-ish people, 8 to 10, ayahuasca, psilocybin, whatever it is, in a very small group type ceremony, I would not feel comfortable having a deep dive experience in that setting. It would be, to me, that sounds traumatic. I would not, that does not sound like fun at all or helpful. So, keep that in mind as you go through. And then also when you're vetting centers, what is their medical process like? What is their medical intake like? If they're not asking you medical questions, or they don't have a medical staff nearby, run for the hills, like super important stuff. So, and then, I'm always happy to help in whatever way I can. I don't always have the most bandwidth these days, but if it's easy questions I can answer via email or Instagram or LinkedIn or whatever, where it's just sort of like setting people up with resources or info, I'm happy to help however I can, because I know it's a gray area and it is really challenging to get good information these days. So I want people to be safe and, get the most out of it.
Well, this was super helpful, Doc. I think you guys framed it up in a really good way of like, this is obviously a great opportunity, but you need to approach it the right way and don't just, particularly, for maybe some of my teammates, the team guys, like, we don't really know moderation. So it's like, oh yeah, we can go get high in, freaking Peru for 7 days and just get all fucked up and trip. Like, yeah. And then I'm going to be healed. Like, you could see how some might
for sure
short stroke that and just go do the experience, but not do the front or the back end. So I'm glad you guys framed that up. And I thought that was really cool, Doc, how you framed up how it primes you for change when those wheels are in that rut. Now, that was a really good visual for me of like, all right, so, but you got to prime it in advance, right? Of what are those changes going to be? And then you experience it. And then maybe you come back, let it settle. And then you have that opportunity, that window of time to really implement change, where maybe previously in your life, there was a lot of inertia to that change. Like, it's almost like exactly what you said, where you want to go, but you just get in the same cycle of thoughts of, oh, I'll do that tomorrow. Or, I'll start that new morning routine next week. You know what I mean? And then a year goes by, you haven't done shit. You know what I mean? Or it's the pattern of your thoughts. It's not just the physical things, it's the mental stuff too. So this is super insightful, Doc. I appreciate it. Quick plug. I don't know if this is the same one, Doc, but the SEAL Future Foundation, for any of the SEALs out there that are listening, they have a few retreats, and I know one of them, I believe, is in Costa Rica, where it's SEALs only, and the SEAL Future Foundation pays for it. And it's like a very tight knit, I think it's a 6 or 7 day thing, but you're only with other team guys, and it's very controlled. And I've heard great things from that. So they actually, asked me if I wanted to go on that next year. And I've never done a drug in my life. So I'm like kind of that Midwest guy, old school, you know what I mean? But it's really intriguing to me. And it doesn't sound like it's this crazy dangerous thing that I'm going to, you know what I mean? So I appreciate you guys breaking that out. And I definitely probably will be leaning on you, Doc, in the future for a little bit of advice. But
for sure.
And for the listeners, I think, Doc, you put out a lot on your Instagram, especially like stories and stuff, tidbits about this. You're at Doc Pate, right? Is it doc.pate on Instagram?
Yes, doc.pate.
Okay,
Yep.
so check Doc out. She puts out a lot of content. And thank you, Doc, for all that you do, for the veteran and first responder communities. I know that's how, obviously, I came across you out at Stronghold out in Utah, which was really cool. And I'm glad we could get you on. I think these are the types of things Tony and I want to get into more on the podcast. We got a wide variety of topics, but to me, these are very applicable things that people can walk away with, that might be able to, immediately benefit their lives. So this was fascinating. I think we could have went Joe Rogan style 4 hours on this one, but I think this was a good, overview of what's out there, kind of some of the pitfalls, how to approach it. And I encourage anyone, that feels like they could benefit from this, be proactive and look into this and see if it's something that might be able to help your life. Anything else you want to plug for the viewers, Doc, before we close her out?
No, I think, yeah, you guys, I love that you mentioned the Seal Future Foundation. I think there are other foundations as well. If you're part of a specific community like the SEAL community or SF or the Ranger community, there may be organizations that don't necessarily advertise like, hey, we help heal veterans through psychedelics, but they may offer funding for psychedelic therapy or treatment. So I would also just keep that in mind for those of you who are curious around that and maybe want to go through a different organization. There's a lot of people out there. SOCF is another great organization that funds a lot of support for guys and gals to go experience treatment like this, and including family members and spouses sometimes too. So,
yeah, and it's one of those things. I think the last thing I'll leave it with is like, particularly the guys that are going through some shit, from the special operations community. Like, unfortunately, Doc, at this point, we're getting a text. It seems like once a month, a guy killing himself from our community. There was just one, I think, this week, right? You see a Black Trident on Instagram, someone killed themselves, and we all text each other who was it, and you find out a couple days later, and you're like, what the fuck? If the guys are listening that are in that position, or anyone, not just anyone in the special operations community, like, this is an option, right? So like, be proactive and try it and put yourself out there and see what resources are available. There's so many charities now that are helping out those guys that would be perfect candidate for this, but instead we go internal. You know what I mean? We try to deal with it ourselves, and that, of course, sometimes that doesn't work, and we end up having to bury somebody. So hopefully, this will continue to evolve in the the literature and kind of, just common knowledge stuff becomes more prevalent, and then guys won't feel that resistance to go try something like this, because there'll be more providers available and more just education out there. So thanks again, Doc. Don't be a stranger. We really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy lady, so
absolutely,
much appreciated. Yeah. And maybe I'll see you out in Utah again.
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. Take care, Doc.
Thanks,
appreciate
Doc.
it.